present here. Am I audible?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
You're audible now.
You're audible.
All right. So I'm Miss Damon. I'm made to be doctor. I've submitted my thesis. I'm waiting for the viva. So thanks for all the blessings that people have called in. And today we are going to look at micro skills for suicide prevention program. I think this program has been ideally planned in the month of October, because October is the month of World Suicide Prevention Month. And before looking at what are the micro skills for suicide prevention, so I'll be touching at my presentation will focus on these areas to set a context about what is suicide and magnitude of the problem, and what is the global statistics. So where do, as in India, as a country, where do we stand in the suicidal rate? And what are the risk factors that are associated with suicide, and what are the warning signs? And it's very important for us to understand what are the myth and fact about suicide. And broadly, I'll be discussing about the micro skills for suicide prevention. So when you look at the concept of what is suicide, suicide comes from the Latin word su means oneself and cide means killing. So when you look at that, it is a conscious decision made by the individual to kill themselves, to end their life. So suicide refers to an act with a fatal outcome that is deliberately initiated. So they consciously know about what is the consequences and what they are doing. And when you look at the global burden of suicide, it's not only an individual decision, it's not only the individual problem, it's a serious public health issue, because it's highly preventable. And why suicide is very complicated, because there is no single cause, or there's no single reason behind, or when you look at what is the rationally behind, there's always complexity that are attached with it. It can be biological, it can be psychological, or it can be socio-cultural, or it can be the environmental triggers, or it can be the combinations of altogether. It's very imperative to understand that when working with suicidal people, know what is the one of the trigger factor, or why is that, when you look at, the problems are inevitable. People throughout the globe experience a problem. How is someone able to survive, resilient, and move forward in life, even when they're stuck with issues? How they are able to understand the issue, bounce back, and move forward? Why are certain people stuck and they quit life? It is so complicated in it to understand, but it is highly preventable. If suicidal ideation is identified at the right time, if interventions are given, it is 100% preventable. And when you look at the suicide, what is the magnitude of the problem? There are two things that we need to understand. People who commit suicide across the globe, it is 8 lakh people. So every year we lose to suicide. And people who attempt suicide are the one, they make number of attempts, but they fail in suicide. And for every 40 seconds, a person commits suicide somewhere in the world. For every 40 seconds, someone is dying because of various other issues, and it could be preventable. And when you look at what is the statistics of people who are attempting for suicide, it's for every 3 seconds, a person try to attempt suicide. And when you look into the gender lens of it, men are the one who succeed in suicide, whereas women, the one try. The number of attempts taken by people who are attempting suicide are women. And when you look at what the common methods of attempting suicide, it could be the injection of pesticide, hanging, firearms. There could be any other reasons, any other modality that they are adopting. But as far as nation of India is concerned, the top 3 are pesticide, because we have the agrarian population. A lot of suicide happens in those regions. So pesticides, taking of pesticide is one of the reason, one of the method, and number 2 is hanging. For each suicide, there's a serious impact that it's not only, as I said, suicide does not really affects the person who's committing it. It also affects the loved ones around. So statistics and a lot of the research says that it could at least have a very greater negative impact on the close 6 person who are around. So it could be their family members or friends. So when you look at, the suicide could be vulnerable for any people from across the lifespan. It could be the children who can be, or it can be adolescent, or it can be elderly, or it can be women. But it says that statistics says that the adolescent age, especially, adolescent to youthhood, 15 to 29, who are the high risk for suicide. So these are the people who attempt suicide, and they also end up in committing suicide. So when you look at the global statistics where India stands in, and you see that in 10th, so suicidal rates are high in India, and especially in South Asian countries, you see that suicidal rates are really high. And when you look into the gender lens of what is the global statistics of suicidal rate and where does India position in that, India actually exceeds the global standard. So India's suicidal rates exceed the global range. So when you look into that, the global range in 2016 for men, it is 15.6, whereas in India, it is 21.2. And whereas for women, the global standard it's 7, whereas in India it is 14.7. So it is high. So when compared to the global standard, so there's a greater need to talk about suicide. People think that talking about suicide is a bad idea because it might give an intrusion to others, it might give an idea to others. But the fact is, talking about suicide can give them, elevate their pain. It can give a scope for people to talk about the pain that they have. And so it's very important to, as an educators, as an academicians, or as a practitioners, talking and reflecting on it. So again, when you talk about the Indian statistics of NCRB rate, so every year it is always from 2017, 18, and 19, you look into the statistic, it says that no, we are losing 1 lakh population due to this preventable suicide. So this is not a very fact that can be acceptable, but it's very imperative that, how as a multidisciplinary team that we collaboratively work, it has to be seen as a serious issue. Because now looking into the pandemic across the globe, you see that there are about 1 crore people die of COVID, and that's become a very serious issue. That's a communicable disease, and people are panicking about it. But somewhere that concept of suicide has been taken very lightly, because it is not the number of suicidal rates are not reported in the newspapers, highlighted in the medias. So not much awareness are there about suicidal rates. And when you look at on an average, 381 people die of suicide, so which is alarming. And again, when you look at the suicidal rates in the city, especially in the metropolitan cities, it is 13.9%. So it is higher when compared to the rural population. Why suicide prevention, especially being a mental health professionals, why it is very important? Suicide prevention is a global protocol. When you look at WHO's Mental Health Gap Action Plan, which was launched in 2008, it has been mentioned that suicide is one of the priority condition to be noted. And they started working on a gap plan in 2008. And again, in 2014, when you look at the first WHO World Suicide Report, it exhaustively talks about, very imperatively talking about, as a mental health professionals, our protocol is to focus more on suicide prevention programs. And again, when you look at that report specifically says that higher priority should be given on the global public health agenda, that suicide is not just one of individual concern, it is a global and a public health concern. And again, when you look at in 2013 and 2020 World Mental Health Action Plan, the WHO members, stated that it is very important that they have set a target, that the global target of reducing suicidal rate in countries by 10%. Now, things are, due to this pandemic, things are little outside the control. So the reports are not yet out. We don't know how much as a team, as a globe, we have worked on in reducing the suicidal rate. And in order to work in the prevention program, it is very important to understand what is the mindset of the suicidal persons. There are 3 different perspectives that I would like to give. What could be this mindset? Say, for instance, one is the ambivalence. What is ambivalence? There is a myth about suicide that people think that, people who wants to commit suicide have a very strong, determined plan about committing suicide. But the fact is, there is a component of ambivalence, because people who have suicidal ideation and they wanted to commit suicide, they have the mixed feeling about committing suicide. They are on the cat on the wall. They wish to leave and they wish to die. When you look into their closer look into what is their understanding, they really wanted to elevate themselves from the pain. It is not they wish to die, they really wanted to elevate themselves from the pain. It could be the pain of some physical illness that they undergo, it could be the pain of some financial crisis that they undergo, it could be the pain of any relationship breakdown that they undergo, it could be the career downfall that they undergo, or it could be work pressure. But they really wanted to elevate themselves from the pain. It's not they wanted to die, but they think that there is not much option. So that's why I say that it is an ambivalence condition. So they have a zigzag feeling, the mixed feeling. So there is an urge to get away from the pain of living, because for them, living with that issue of any crisis is very painful. They wanted to elevate themselves from the pain. So this is a typical mindset of majority of the persons who have suicidal ideation. Number two, impulsivity. Again, impulsivity, suicide is also an impulsive act, but still the suicidal ideation can be predicted. The ideation that the individual have, if they have any crisis, suicide is an ideation. If they have said that as a perspective, that could be easily identified through the intervention processes that we work with. So while suicide being an impulsive activity, the impulse to commit suicide is very transient, and it lasts for a few hours. People think that when people have the suicidal ideation once, they might remain throughout the life, that ideation. Not necessarily. It's just whenever they have the trigger, if they have the certain ideation developed before, if they have definitely seen somebody committing suicide and elevating their pain, or they have said that suicide is the only option in their mind, some triggers can help them in easing that impulsivity. So it is usually triggered by the negative events. Higher the negative events, higher could be the decision towards committing suicide. So when we are working in the center, how are we going to identify what are the negative triggers that they have, and elevating that can ease them to come into the normal situation. And third is talking about the rigidity. It's again complexity. One side you talk about, ambivalence. One side you talk about rigidity. Rigidity is that, when people are suicidal, their thinking and the feeling and the actions are constricted. They think that, in order to elevate from the pain, they would have said that, ending their life is the only option. It's the only option. So they're not able to ask for others for help, or probably they would have asked for help that they wouldn't have got it, or they wouldn't have had a trusted person where they can share it. So this is where the rigidity, they think that in order to overcome this financial crisis, this is the option. If the debt level is high, this is the option. If the physical pain is really high, or if there is a negative report that they received for their loved ones or anything, they think that, they're thinking and everything is constricted. So they don't ask for help. They constantly think about suicide and they're unable to perceive other way out of the problem. So this is something about the three angles that we need to look at. And again, when you want to work in a setting, it's very important how we identify, assess, and manage and refer them to the health center. Now we are going to look at what are the micro skills. Very important. So I'm going to, Nirmala ma'am has a set of context of different micro skills. I'm going to precisely talk about 5 to 6 different micro skills. This micro skills is not only necessarily working in suicide prevention, it could applicable in any kind of a health setting, and predominantly it could be in the areas of mental health interventions. Number one, listening, active listening. And active listening establishes, very important that it could be established during the good trust, during the rapport building stages. And most importantly, in active listening, it not only builds the therapeutic alliance, but also client feel that active listening, it also gives a sign. It also gives a sign to the client that you're listening to them, you're also understanding their feeling. In a way, you're also telling the client that you're respecting them. Listening. So in counseling, we always say it is 80-20. So it is 80% of listening and 20% of talking to them. So listening, and majority of the time, when you look at why listening is so important, people have this impulsivity, as I talked about suicide. So there is a natural resilience. if the mind is full of confusion, there's a lot of insecurities about their life, there is a lot of threat is there. If they really have a good platform to express their emotions, express their feeling, when everything comes out, the process we call as catharsis, then the moments can be lightened, and they can have their own solutions to that. Problem with majority of the people who have suicidal ideation is they don't get a good platform to talk to people, or in a way I can say that they don't get good listeners whom they can share their problem. And again, when I talk about listeners, they are active listeners. When I say active listeners, who are not very passive about it, we are very active and without having any judgmental attitude. So very feeling. And when we talk about active listening, there are three things. As I said, suicide will always comes with a lot of people. Ideation will have a lot of warning signs. It could be the verbal markers. So when you have to talk about verbal markers, it can be the talk. Say for instance, they say that constantly say, they might say that I feel like killing myself, and I don't want to be a burden to others. I don't think so. There is no reason for me to live. I think that I've been feeling trapped. But what do you see in contrary? People say one of the myth about suicide is people who talk will never do it. But the fact is, when they in suicide, when people talk about it, they are looking for people who can listen to them. They wanted to know whether anybody is interested in listening to them, and anybody interested or anybody have a contrary thought about it. So when people talk, give those verbal markers, this shouldn't be taken at a very light sense. When people say it could be simple talk, they can say that, I don't think there's no point in living. And whenever they talk, there are two things that you can observe. One is the talk, which will always associated telling them they are not worthlessness talk, and number two is about hopelessness. They talk about these two things will be in it could be in different forms that they could express it. Somebody would say that there's no point, nobody loves me, so I don't want to live. So it talks about they don't think that they are worth enough. Or I think that even I'm going to work for another 2 years, I don't think so I can build up this financial position. It talks about their hopelessness. So these two things, feeling worthless, they're not worth about it, and again doesn't have good hope and hopelessness. These two situations are the good of the verbal markers that you can look for the warning signs. And number two, when you're talking about the warning signs in the behavior, withdrawal of activities, it could be suddenly. Both the ways you can say. A lot of statistics says that there are certain people who have the strong suicidal ideation. By personality, they could be very introvert. By when they have the personality, when they wanted to commit suicide, probably that's where they open up. They go meet friends, they meet relatives. So sudden withdrawal of behavior. It is not whether they wanted to either by being very passive they can be active, or by being active they can be either ways around. They wanted to end their life, but they wanted to go meet their friends. Suddenly they can be very highly socializable. It could be one of the reason as well. So when you look at a sudden change in the behavior, that could be one of the warning signs. Again, say for instance, as I said, in the initial, adolescents are the one group that is highly prone for suicide, high risk for suicide. You see that actively, recklessly driving, so rash behaviors. And again, when you look into the sleeping pattern, either they sleep too much, they wanted to be in their isolation, they wanted to be alone, and they wanted to withdraw themselves. They doesn't want to talk. A lot of aggression. They're aggressive. It might be expressed in the form of words, or it can be expressed in the form of actions. It could be intake of drugs, alcohol. So these are all the sudden change in the behavior that could be observed. And again, the warning signs could be expressed, or when it is expressed, it can be felt only by the loved ones whom they are close, or the person whom they communicate very closely. It could be their family members, or it could be the peers. And when we talk about the warning signs related to mood, it could be symptoms related to depression. They feel very humiliated about it, or they keep talking about that. I don't know what is going to happen in another 10 days. Oh, this notice has come. I don't know what are the. So they felt they will lose a lot of. So it's a combination of all. So when you talk about depression, it can be expressed in the verbal form, or the feeling of humiliation. They can express it out. Irritability, lot of losing the interest in anything that they could do. Feeling of anxiousness. And when you look into it, there are certain concrete signals that they might give it to you. So for instance, one of the signal that you can identify when you're working with them. Earlier attempt of suicide, it says that, 10 out of 7 people who try attempting suicide, the earlier signs would always be present, or either could be the instant of self-harming, hurting themselves, banging themselves. All those would have got over a period of time so rigor, and they would have got this suicidal ideation. So identifying the earliest symptoms of suicidal attempt is one of the risk factor that is associated with suicidal ideation. Anxiety and panic, withdrawal of behavior, so sudden withdrawal from the family, friends. And then you see that, one of the very critical thing that you understand working with them, self-hatredness, feeling very guilty, as I said, worthlessness, ashamed. So a lack of self-love, you would see. If at all there is a self-love high, then definitely there is not an ideation for them to commit suicide. Though they hate themselves, they have a lot of regrets, that they have feeling of guilty, that they have not contributed something, they have not achieved something, they don't feel that they're worth to live. And this is the common symptoms that you can associate with suicidal ideation persons. Next, when you look at family history of suicide, as I said, when you talk about the adolescent suicide, so definitely it could be the environment where they would get a lot of ideas about suicide. It could be the family history of suicide. Somebody in their family would have attempted suicide. They would thought, okay, in school somebody bullied them or something happens to them, they think that, okay, that's the solution, because they're not, if they're the fragile age, they're not able to take it up, so they might end up it. So it could be the media, because media nowadays is a greater influence, so we should like media gives a lot of influence for the young children. So it could be the influences from outside. And again, talking about the idea, how do you identify the suicidal notes? Some people write the suicidal notes about it, and then repeated mention of death or suicide to somebody else, and feeling of loneliness. And when you talk about it, these are all the risk factors. There's a difference between a warning sign and the risk factor. Warning sign are the concrete signs that people having the suicidal ideation. But the risk factor, it could be the general population. But this is the general population needs awareness about suicide, because anywhere down in the line, they could fall under the category of attempting or committing. So for instance, people who have physical disabilities, so they are a high risk for suicide. Number two, any loss in the relationship, losing a friend and the family members. Again, as I said, exposing themselves to bullying, especially that happens during the age of adolescent and youthhood. Any severe mental health conditions, or losing any of the relationship, access to any harmful means. All these are the combinations of the other factors which make them very risk for suicide. One other micro skill that is very important in working with suicide prevention is questioning. Understanding the client effectively through questioning is very, very important. The questioning, when we talk about questioning, it's not only the initial stage, we question them a lot. We use this micro skill of questioning to understand the patient or understand the client, understand the person. But throughout the process, it is very important, because, throughout the process, we need to keep asking. So I'm going to give you some debriefing understanding about it. Let's say to find out whether the person has a definite plan to commit suicide. Let's say you're working in a clinic and you have a person who has an instant of self-harm coming, or attempted, you're in a crisis care, they have come. So could be a very direct question. Have you made any plans to end your life? Do you have any plans to end your life? People have a myth thinking that, asking a direct question can give them a lead. No, asking a direct question, because when we work in a crisis center, when we are working in the crisis call, we have very limited time. The time frame is very, very crucial. Instead of asking too many things, the questions can be really, really direct. So have you made any plans to end your life? Or it could be the questions like, do you have an idea of how you're going to do it? Do you have, because sometimes people say that, I really want to kill myself, I really want to elevate. When you ask them, they would think, they would take time to think, which means they did not have a concrete plan about it. So in that case, you have a breathing space, so you can slowly work on identifying what is the rationale behind it, slowly working on the problem solving process. If they have clearly have a plan, they say that, yes, I have bought the pills, or I have a knife, or I have set the rope at home, then you have very little time. So if you are a trained person, you can directly work on, or if this case has to be referred to the mental health center. And when you talk about to identify the plan, you have asked this question. In fact, if you have identified the person has real plan, then the next question should be related to asking what is the mean. To find out whether the person has got any means or method, the question could be again still very direct. Do you have any pills or rope or insect? So how are you going to do it? You're saying that you wanted to end your life. So tell me, how are you going to do it? So have you made any plans? Is it really readily available to you? So these are the question will help us to understand where in which range the patient is. Based on that, our response should be there. It should be very, very assertive in communication. And third, so if you have identified what is the plan that the patient has, or what is the person has. Number two, identify what is the means or the method. Number three is the time frame. Very, very critical, because to find out whether the person has a fixed time, certain people will have fixed time. They will say that, remember, working, got a crisis call 4 years before. It was for talking about call inquiring about organ transplantation. Person said, the other side, the person said that, madam wanted to know whether I can donate my organs. I said, like, okay, you can donate your organs. Which is the organs you want to say? That I'm going to commit suicide now. Within how many minutes I can donate my organs? So I think the time frame is very crucial. There you cannot do any minute. So that person has to be reported to the emergency, either to the identifying the location, and the police has to be informed. And again, the material team has to be informed. There you don't have enough time. So in that time, very important, once you identify what is the plan, what is the method, then you identify what is the time frame. Ask a direct question. Have you decided when you have planned to end the life? Because certain people will say that, I really want to commit suicide, but I know I want to visit my children, and I wanted to set things up, or I wanted to write a will, so about my, or I want to settle up certain things. I have issues in my office, I want to settle up this, or this person insulted me, I have to prove himself that this is wrong, and then I want to end. So they would have certain time frame in that. Very, very important. Identify whether they have any plans. Number two, identify what is the means that they have. And number three, time frame. So when are you planning to do it? So you can ask them. And on a third important micro skill, this micro skill not only for suicide, it is for any program that, or even that, I would say that's one of the life skill that's very important. Empathy, understanding person's feeling. And this word empathy is very, very crucial for all social workers, I believe. And say, for instance, when you work with a client, especially when you work in a setting like crisis care, a lot of emotional involvements are there. What happens, instead of feeling for the client, the worker most of the time feel with the client. There's a lot of difference between feeling for the client and feeling with the client. So when you feel for the client, you still have your professional boundaries, but you still have the emotional connect. All right, you have the working ethic. But when you feel with the client, you are so more close to the client emotionally, and you stop having that emotional boundaries with the client. And especially when you're working with a client in a crisis care like suicide, very important empathetic understanding. So when you have empathetic feeling for the client is so important, but you should consciously don't feel with a client. Very important. So empathy, as I said, your ability to imagine oneself. Say, for instance, sometimes when you work with a client, one client comes a serious issue and want to commit suicide. Some client come, it's because they have an issue in the organization, they want to end up committing suicide. So understanding the client, each person have got their own capacity to understand their situation. For some, even if it is grade 3 level problem, they can take it. For some, even if it is a small issue, they will not. For them, what is that? What does it means to them? Understanding them is so important. So when you're working with a client, there are two things that you need to understand empathetically. Is it a concept of self-harm or self-suicide? Most of the time when you're working with suicidal patients, you will see the component of self-harm. So it's very important. So what is the difference between self-harm and suicide? The frequency, the incidence of frequency are high in self-harm. Say, for instance, they would be repeatedly. Say, for instance, whenever there is a trigger comes, say for when there is then they face any discrimination, or when they face any hurt, every time, or when they would have faced a discrimination once, or faced any kind of a hatredness once, every time when they sit in their room, think about themselves and wanted to ease themselves, they just cut. So the frequency is really high in self-harm, whereas an attempt, the frequency is very low, very less when compared to self-harm. Again, the method, it's always cutting or burning themselves with a candle or a light or something, self-hitting, banging themselves. So these are all the methods, whereas attempting is more a higher degree where they wanted to poison themselves. Severity is very less in self-harm, whereas in suicide it is more severe, and it can sometimes lead to, most of the time it can lead to death. And purpose of self-harm, they're done only to avoid the suicidal impulse, whereas here there's a concrete plan that they want to die. And very important, when you have a client, when you're working in a crisis center, when any instance of self-harm is entered, it need to be given important. It need to be given necessary attention. Ask them if there are a lot of cuts are there. Ask them why first cut, what was the trigger, second or third, is there a similar pattern? Because suicidal, it's a lot of patterns are attached with that. So because they have this ideation, they think that if everything happens, it is their self. So hurting their self is somewhere that you feel that they did something justice to something that has happened. It could lead them to the greater level of ending their life as well. Another thing working with a suicidal patient is communication. Very important. It is very important to have a very clear communication. Again, I talk about the myth. People say that, when they have the suicidal ideation, the communication, you don't tell them exactly what happens, or you don't tell the family member. The communication has to be very straightforward. Very, very straightforward. Say, for instance, when you're working with a client, there are some do's and don'ts about communication. Number one, talk honestly and genuinely. Let's say when a client comes and the client says that this much of physical pain that I am undergoing, so I really feel like killing myself. Be very honest. We cannot say that, oh no, 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 all the pain will be gone tomorrow. That's not practically, or we don't know what is happening. Say that, this is what you might undergo a pain, but these are the things that are being taken care. Right. So talk honestly and be very genuinely. Why? Because if they have come to you, if they have come to the crisis center, if they probably, there could be a lot of chances they would have contacted their friends, contact their family members. All those would have been, not much have been professional. All those unprofessional would have said the same thing. Don't worry, everything will be normal. If as a professional you're going to tell the same thing, I think there the trust is going to broken. So talk honestly and be very genuine about what is the situation, and listen attentively and be calm. So these are the things about those. And number two, when you talk about it, express the respect for the person, opinions and their values. Say, for instance, even if they have said that, they wanted to commit suicide, we don't tell them that's a good idea or that's a bad idea, but tell them that this is the consequences. I understand this is the pain that you're undergoing, but after that, you think that the pain is going to come to an end? No, it's just the person is going to die and the pain is going to continue. It doesn't stop with one person. The pain is going to continue, the depth is going to continue, or the financial crisis is going to continue. Earlier it was just only the financial crisis, now only the human crisis also, the death of the loved one is also there. So talk about so not criticizing about the decision, but tell them what the decision that they made is a bad decision, but do not criticize about it. Accept, respect them. Number three, understanding person's feeling. As I said, empathetically understand why they made this decision. Sometimes remember talking to a person wanted to had a very strong suicidal ideation because one of the trusted friend has cheated them. It was in an adolescent age. Probably that wouldn't have been a very major issue for a bigger suicidal issues, but for that person it is a hurt. It is for that person, they wanted to end their life. So understand that person, what it means to them, understand them, and then give non-verbal message of accept and respect. As ma'am said elaborately, ma'am has explained about a lot of gestures, and so I'm not going to go deep into it. And then show your concern, care and warmth. Focus on person's feeling. Ask them what it is. I want to kill myself. Ask them why you wanted to kill yourself. What happens to you? What happens to you? Ask them about feeling. Let them express their feeling out. If this person spoke to me this way, when the person spoke to you, what had happened to you? How did it affect your feeling? Elaborately. Most of the time when they're so much in their mind, when there's a space is given for them, when they talk, it can lighten, it can also give a space for them to revisit their decision that they have made. Very important. So focus on the person's feeling, listen and be empathetic, and then being supportive. We will focus more on what are don'ts, what are the things that we do not, is not supposed to do during crisis counseling, especially working in suicide prevention. Interrupt too often. If their stories, especially when there's so much in their mind, they wanted to tell everything, don't interrupt too much because the flow gets affected. Let them say. Sometimes, when you're working with a client, we know about the worker client, the percentage of ratios of how many people, the burden of patients that we have. It's critical, but it's very important because that tells that we respect them and we are carefully listening to them. Do not ask loaded questions. When do you want to do it? What happened? What did this person? Let it go in a flow. Let it go in a flow. So asking too many questions, that can stop the flow. Number 3, very important, do not be very shocked or emotional. Oh, this has happened to you. Oh no. So all this question, all these things can actually give a negative feeling to them. Or sometimes if they're already negative about it, it gives a reconfirmation, negative reconfirmation from your end. Okay, so I also felt this way only. So very, do not be very shocked or not give very emotional embarrassment or giving panic about this. This is what happened. So one of the clients said that during it was next day, all big wedding has been set, but the groom has just escaped. So in those cases, natural to give a shock, but if you do it the same that person, because already the negative energy is running and you're reconfirming that with the client. So do not do that. Sometimes conveying that you're too busy and ignoring the situation. These are all the communication strategies that we should not do it, especially working in a crisis center. And challenging the person to go it. Sometimes, when you're working with a suicidal ideation persons, it's not in one sitting that they get convinced about the decision. So you repeatedly spend the 30 minutes of the talk. End of the 30th minute, they still talk. You do all the conversation. Then they say that, it's okay, ma'am. However, I spoken anyway. I think that there's no worth in living. Do not give up. Do not give up on the client, because we are called to work for them. And in case if you're not competent in that area, please refer them to the mental health professionals. Challenging the person. Okay, I have told whatever I did. Please go and do whatever you want. No. That is not the place where we can show up our own emotions there, our own because we have this long burden of working with them, and even other, there is no outcome that we expect doesn't mean that we can show up their anger or show up our challenge to the client. Making the problem appealing very as if it is so simple, or giving a false assurance. I said no, never give a false assurance, because when people come for the suicide prevention center asking for a help, definitely you're not the first person that they've communicated. Definitely they would have given the verbal markers to their family members or the loved ones. Whatever the fake assurance that they have given, they're not convinced about it. That's why they are coming here. Let's not give the fake assurance. Be very practical, be honest, and talking about it. And then very important to understand what are the myths about suicide. As I said, talking about suicide, people think that it's a bad idea, but can be interpreted as an encouragement. No, it's a good idea. Thinking about suicide, it can give a platform for people to express about it. Someone who's suicidal is determined to die. It is not they are determined to die, but they have strong determination to end their life, end their problem, elevate their pain. So they choose suicide. And number 3, people who talk about suicide do not mean to do it. People think, no, whenever they give verbal markers, when they are vocal about it, then they will not do it. That is a total myth. People will be looking for people to share about their problems, and they would express in a verbal markers or emotional markers. Only people with a mental health disorder or suicide can happen to anybody else. It's just about the trigger. And most suicide happens suddenly without a warning. People think that it is neither preventable nor predictable. It is highly preventable when it is predicted at the right time, because though suicide can be in certain cases impulsive, but the suicidal ideation can always be assessed. It can be predicted so that it can be prevented. Again, when someone is suicidal, he or she will always remain suicidal. No. Say for instance, if this is pressure, they had the suicidal ideation, not necessarily they have to remain throughout the life with us. So these are all the myth about suicide. And the last micro skill that I'm going to talk about is observation. Very important, taking the situation very, observation helps the client or the worker to take the situation more seriously and assess the degree of the risk. As I said, some will be in the planning stage, some will be just having the ideation, some will be in the planning stage, some will be having set the means, some will be really set the time frame. So observing in which stage they are, based on that our interventions, based on that we need to do the referrals and everything. And client observation, when you look at the client observation, it is very very important. It helps to identify all the discrepancies in the life. And our body languages are very important, tone of voice, our facial expressions, very important. There are a lot of emotional markers are there for us to observe. Feeling very depressed, lack of interest in the activity once they could have enjoyed. All right, so irritability, anger, and anxiety, shame, they feel very shame about it, they feel very humiliated. Mood swings, these are all the emotional markers that you can see. Verbal markers. So again, when you talk about verbal markers, there are two different statements. Both the statements need to be looked into carefully. One is an active statement. Active statement can be very very direct. I'm going to kill myself. All right, so the passive statement is, I wish I could sleep and I don't get up later. I wish, the world ends now. I wish that, something happens in the building that I get collapsed. So it could be active or it could be passive. What happens is, most of the time we give more importance to the active statements and we leave out the passive statements. So when you're working with a client, especially in the mental health setting, lot of passive statement that you go. So when they talk about this passive statement, take time and ask them. So you were talking about, that you wish don't want to wake up or you don't want to see them. Why do you say that way? Elaborate on that. So there are a lot of passive statements can be a lead. Probably they don't know how to communicate, or their personality is that they don't communicate very straightforward. So both active statements and the passive statements should be looked into. Those could be the verbal markers. And again, some of these statements could be including killing themselves, that they think that there is no purpose in life, they are not, they feel that they are burden to others. They sometimes they'll say that no, a person should live only till the age of 50, after that there's no worth in living. So that could be a passive statement. That could be, ask them, why do you say that way? Why do you say that way? So this could be the passive statement. They are feeling stuck about it, they're not able to move forward because they feel very insecure about their future, and they doesn't wanting to exit as well. Lot of behavioral markers that you could observe. And some of the behavioral markers that you see in the slide, they don't communicate frequently. Social withdrawal, you will see that they doesn't want it to sweat. And another behavioral marker, you could see that highly they can, now you see recent suicidal, you see that Instagram, in the Instagrams, in the Facebook, they have openly said that they doesn't want to live, they doesn't want to. So it can be either way. It can be they wanted to openly communicate that they wanted to die, or the, I don't think that my fans still love me, I don't think that I've did justice to the role that has been given to me. So these are all the passive statement that they have given. It could be either ways. And sometimes behavior markers, driving recklessly and increased aggression. Sometimes it is more rigor in the elderly, giving away all the possessions or writing a will for the family, settling all those things. Or sometimes they wanted to visit their the holy places that they wanted to do it, or sleep. And these are all the markers that you will see, gathering materials related to their settlements and everything. So when you identify, when you're using the micro skills, identifying what are all the suicidal ideation that they have, it is very important that we respond to them immediately. I just got one few points to say. When you are identifying, when you have a person, stay with that person, never leave the person alone, inform the family and enlist its support, gently talk to the person and remove. When you identified, is there any risk factor associated with they have this means, kindly remove it. And if you're a trained person, be with that person and do the intervention. If not, kindly refer that person to a mental health professionals or call to the tele centers.